Hello and welcome to Dark Loops, The Divide. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Jordan, aka Zombie Scotty, cognitive psychologist philosopher from Illinois State University. And in tonight's episode, we discuss the Amazon Prime series, Them. Gentlemen, please tell us who you are and how you feel your expertise will contribute to our understanding of the divide. And we will begin with Steve Hunt.
Yeah, good evening. My name is Steve Hunt, and I'm professor and director of the School of Communication here at Illinois State University. I love this group. We've done a lot of interesting things together, and this is just an extension of that. And one of the things that got me interested in them is based on some previous work that we've done together that we'll probably talk about tonight, but my interest in persuasion and civic and political engagement, in political communication and in political polarization and the pedagogy of anti-racism. And I think there's so many deep connections to this series, to those interests. So those are some of the things that really draw me to them.
No, fantastic. So glad that you're part of this. And we'll move on to Byron.
Hi, I'm Dr. Byron Craig. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Communication. That was my boss that just taught. And so for me, I come to this with an interest in, I'm a rhetorician, so an interest in how we can see trauma through this show. And we can talk a little later about how it's been critiqued as trauma porn, which I kind of want to push back on because of some revelations I've had about the show. But also because I have a background in African-American studies as well. And in this show, thinking about, this notion of divide here kind of ties into some themes, or a big theme that I want to talk about tonight with something that I noticed, which is going on in politics right now. And it has to do with Cheney and the vote today.
Fantastic. Excellent. And Nathan.
Hi, I'm Dr. Nathan Carpenter, Director of Convergent Media for the School of Communication. Sometimes they call me Dr. Smack because I run our Social Media Analytics Command Center, or the SMAC as it's commonly known. And most of my work really for this kind of group and my interests around the social media conversations. And so I spend probably way too much time just tweaking little scripts and computer programs to collect data from places like Twitter and find ways to analyze and visualize all that information. But the topic I think is also incredibly interesting historically, and I think about a lot of my own family narratives that I think are really entwined in this series. Again, I think from the white perspective and the Protestant immigrant perspective as well, which I think I'll definitely be talking about. I hope I'll be talking about tonight too. Mm-hmm. So a couple interests, one being personal, but second professional, again, being the data and analytics guy here.
Fantastic. And Steve.
Well, my name is Dr. Steve Rocco. I'm a lecturer at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. And I'm delighted to join all of you here tonight, my colleagues from the other Bloomington. I'm in Indiana. So, I'm also a scholar of rhetoric. I have a degree in communication studies, and, I consider myself a rhetorical critic. And, my interest in rhetoric from a scholarly perspective is really looking at the intersections of capitalism and race. And so for me, I come to this series with an interest in looking at how it represents race and the violence of the history of capitalism. And it becomes an interesting text that kind of intersects with popular culture in that sense. It offers sort of an interesting kind of narrative of the history of capitalism and race. It offers an interesting audience a sense of a kind of way of thinking about that history of the present, how we got to this point, because I think that the kind of historical context of this show is rather interesting. Its reception in this era right after the Trump administration, right after the insurrection on January 6th. So it really brings together a lot of kind of themes of our contemporary social, historical, and political moment that I think that for scholars such as ourselves, we need to interrogate, make sense of, critique, and offer commentary that hopefully offers a productive way of thinking about this as a way of kind of opening up spaces in our public discourse that are currently kind of enclosed by hyper fragmented media networks, hyper kind of fragmented ontologies and the likes. So I'm excited and I'm looking forward to perspectives.
Well, that's fantastic. I'm going to pick up exactly where you left off. As I said, I'm a cognitive psychologist philosopher, and your comment about ontologies, for me, rhetorics, word systems are sort of this cognitive skin of one's ontology, right? They tell you what one is keeping in and what is keeping out. And one thing I've just very much enjoyed working with this crew is we're so knee deep in Twitter, you seeing all the language people are using to keep some in, to keep some out, and to manage those boundaries. For me, I'm always looking for a rhetorical system that admits to that aspect of our nature, yet works to be more and more inclusive. So, I've talked about Watchmen with these gentlemen, Lovecraft Country with these gentlemen. All three of these have addressed generational Black trauma, and I would argue in somewhat different genres. And so I'm just thrilled to be here and talk to you about this version in the horror genre and how it might challenge our rhetoric and the cognitive skin of our ideas as we go forward. So really looking forward to this.
So I'm going to switch over to my screen here and share a couple of, I think, important takeaways from what we noticed. So I think first and foremost, you should all know that I was searching for all tweets that use the hashtag them. And I kind of went with an all caps search. And that search was very interesting at the beginning because I kind of started that before the show began. And I didn't do any official studies on this, but just the way that people were hashtagging the word them, like just as like an othering statement, I thought was particularly fascinating. But then really, I just kind of kept going all April and really focused on the premiere of the show, again, on Amazon Prime. And some of the biggest takeaways, I think, were the way people engaged with this show has been different from other series that we've looked at as a group. Again, Scott has mentioned Watchmen, and he's talked a little bit about other dives that we've done as a team, and those have been episodic, right? Like weekly releases. There's no way to binge watch them until after the series is over. And here we are looking at a series that is launched and it's out there, and so we have such a different kind of engagement with Twitter. And so here is, oops, there we go. All right, I'm goofing this up here. There we are. All right, so here we are looking at, first and foremost, just the tweets per hour. And so we can see, again, the premiere, I think, again, was what, April 9, 10, somewhere in that range. And then we've got, kind of a couple of big pushes that emerge, as people are watching and seeing the entire show. And again, we don't get the response to episodes as we would. We get a couple of very high profile posts and retweets off of that and commentary. But then things start to really fizzle out not long after. In fact, I just quit collecting data after about April 27, just because there wasn't anything significant really rolling in that was, again, of interest at that point. So the next thing I took a look at, and this is where things really do get interesting, is just taking a look at the most frequently used pairs of words that were used together. And you can see the words and then the counts. And so starting in the bottom left is where you can see the largest, or at least the most frequent patterns of that. I think first thing we're probably going to talk a little bit about would be episode 5. And I think, again, it was very fascinating to see that on Twitter and to kind of be warned ahead of time that episode 5 is going to be rough, and having that knowledge without, spoiler alert, right? Like it was just prepared to know that episode 5 was going to be rough thanks to Twitter. You can see a couple other episodes show up in here. Episode 1, episode 2, episode 9 was fascinating. I think there's no surprise that we have words in combinations like Black people, white people. Again, this is a show primarily about racial trauma. And the other ones, though, that come up that I think are really fascinating are trauma porn and Black trauma. And that's something I know Dr. Craig is going to bring up and really, I think, articulate some important arguments there. But one of the things that was really prominent were critiques, and especially on Twitter, that said this show particularly glorifies violence at the expense of the horror and social commentary. And I think we're going to run into some divides as we talk about that here tonight as well, right? And then just a couple other things to know about. I did a little bit of sentiment analysis, just getting a sense of how many times were words within certain categories used. And nothing particularly surprising. Again, the fear category came up the most often, but we're talking about a horror series, right? So I would expect that. No surprise there. Based on, again, whenever I see shows discussed, I often see anticipation words show up because people are talking about what they're going to see, or they can't wait for the next episode, or they're waiting for something to come up. And then anger and sadness, I think, again, relate to many of the topics in the show. I'm not surprised there by those topics emerging. And then finally, I think this is an important point to raise. And I won't talk about the top retweets yet until we get into conversation. We can go back and look at those. But I do want to highlight this because this to me is actually really interesting. Not the United States, but the top cities that kept coming up over and over again in the author profiles. These are the unique users. And we can see here there are, oh goodness, yeah, more than 350 Twitter users from Atlanta, and those who are actually just listing Atlanta, Georgia. Like, there were other variations that aren't showing up in this list because it was just a quick keyword scan. And typically what I see are United States, New York, and then LA, and so on and so forth. So for Atlanta to be up here, Houston, LA, Chicago to be beating out New York, I think this tells us something about the audience, right? This is a different group responding. And I don't have good data to jump in and talk about all the demographics, but this is different from what I typically see. And especially seeing Atlanta being the core of the conversation, we might have something unexpected in terms of audience overall.
Well, thank you so much for that, Nathan.
And so my favorite line, I think, in the entire series came from, what is her name? Annette Beaumont. So Annette Beaumont was the character who was in the mental institution, right? And Lucky goes to see her and she's having the conversation with her. And when we see her, when she and Lucky start talking, Beaumont is kind of playing with her arm, the skin on her arm. And so the line is kind of the lines, right? So she says, I won the lottery with this skin, half the rhythm, twice the reward. That's what Mother said. Our wealth didn't hurt, but wealth can only get a colored person so far. What it can't buy is freedom to forget who you are. So for me, that was my favorite line, I think, of the series. And again, I hate using the word favorite, right? It was probably, I think, one of the most intriguing lines for me,
Right.
because it ties so much into, I think, the overall kind of feel in the series itself. Because we see this family, this upwardly mobile Black family, right? As upwardly mobile as they can be. But it does nothing towards buying their freedom. And we have to play around with that term freedom, right? What does that freedom mean for these different Black folk in this time, right? For some of them, it's getting to this space to live in a different place, right? And of course, for Lucky and Henry, it's for escaping that trauma that we see that family go through. But I think it's an interesting line because we can play around with that term freedom in a way, and what that means and why you can't forget who you are and even what that means, right? Not being able to forget who you are, which ties into my whole thing about this show is, this whole notion of the other people wanting America to continue to stay and look like them, right? Which is where we are today, which is why I find this, I've just gone back and watched every episode again, why I find this so profound, because that's what we see going on. And I think this line kind of points that out beautifully in the show. These people want America to remain how they look. They don't want anyone coming into their neighborhood who doesn't look like them, because that can't be America, right? Because that Black skin, that Black person means that they're not human, right? And so by moving into this neighborhood, trying to buy that freedom through property, right? Which is
Right. Well
one of
said.
the things that we talk about, right? The right to own property, whatever. But that can't be for them. They can't buy that no matter what.
Anyone want to follow up on Byron's comment? Well, I'll jump in and to add on to what you say, one of the things I found terribly interesting was how they wrote the white resistance. And what I mean by that is usually most of the people in the crowd started off ambivalent, and they wrote it in such a way that one character sort of pushes the rest of them in a direction. So there's the town hall meeting, there's her pushing the milkman, there's just all this pattern. And I wondered, what are the writers trying to do with that pattern? Because what they're intentionally not doing is having everybody at the same amplitude against this family from the beginning. So I'm wondering, to all of you, were they attempting to say this is how it works? That basically most people are ambivalent and there's a few leaders that lead them, a leader that leads them into this extreme position? Or were they, I don't know, I wasn't sure what I felt the writers were trying to accomplish there.
If I can just really quickly, I think what it does is that it speaks to this notion of how white mob mentality happens, right? How this starts is this notion of, one person saying something,
Right.
or saying that this Negro touched me, right? Or looked at me inappropriately, right? And then it builds from there. And I think that's one of the things, because as I went back and I looked at critiques of the show, how people were saying, well, it's just so it's not organized properly, right? We should have had these stories, these other stories in the beginning. Like, well, if you go back and really look at it, it doesn't need to be in that kind of like way where everything is put out right there for you to follow through, right? I think that's the beauty of it, is that it does bring on these different white characters to have that angst and that anger slowly develop, that probably has been there in them personally.
Yeah.
But it takes someone like Betty to
Right.
really draw that out, right? And of course we know with Betty, there's a lot of psychosis going on, right? There's a lot of stuff going on, which
Right.
doesn't excuse what she does.
No.
But I think there has to be that, that one person that's the origin of this, what we know is already how a lot of them are already feeling
Right.
about this family moving there. But someone has to start that anger and that, well, let's just call it that mob mentality, right? Because we
Right.
see throughout the series, we see these mobs forming, right? Sitting out in the street, playing the music, in the school with the oldest daughter, at the end. So everything builds to, there's a constant building of mob mentality, and I think that's what they were trying to show. Um, and I hope that's kind of like getting to that question you were asking.
Well, it is, because it was an intentional choice by the writers, because even in episode 9, where they talk about the settlement town,
Mm.
the same dynamic plays out,
Yep.
where people are ambivalent about, I mean, there's some people making trouble, but most people are ambivalent. And then over time, the difference in their thoughts flattens out. They all kind of fall in unison in this hate vibe, and then horrible things happen. And I thought that in a show like this, I experienced the writing is intentional. I experienced the writers as saying, this is how this happens.
Mhm.
And I very much thought that was a brilliant way to spell the social situation out, to have people actually act out
Yeah.
the move from ambivalence to hatred certainty, and to show people how that happens in real time to a person and then a group. And it also, dare I say, reflects certain dynamics we've lived in for the past 4 or 5 years, right? Once there's one person who's willing to publicly express their hate, once there's one person who's willing to publicly go that extreme with their thoughts, it sort of invites the rest of the group to that space. So I thought, are the writers trying to make a comment about where we've been for the past 4 or 5 years? Or are they trying to teach us something about this is how it happens, guys? And if you don't want this to happen, you got to be aware when you're in those ambivalent states, and recognize how vulnerable you are in your thoughts, and work against extremes.
I thought it was, Byron, you mentioned Betty. Clearly she's an instigator and all of that, but she does it with a smile, right? Which is so messed up.
Brutal.
But yeah, the most brutal, nasty things that she's saying, and she's smiling while she's doing it. I think there's something there that reflects whiteness in the way that that communication unfurls and the way that it happens.
Yeah, and I think it really speaks to, and I think they're pointing out this notion of white women's complicity, right? And it's kind of what Spike Lee does in Black Klansman, right? When he has the wife of the one character at the end, who is the one who's planting the bomb underneath the sister's car, right? And he does that purposely to show that, no, you don't get a pass on this because you have complicity in these violent racial crimes as well, right? And so I think that certainly exactly what you said, Steve. That Betty does these things with this, this smile, but kind of crazed smile also, right? Because once we get her origin story, also we know there's a lot that's happened in her life. But yeah, definitely is that she's able. I mean, I love when she's, the confrontations with between she and Lucky, and really both of them kind of can play with that kind of smile-ish kind of thing going on their face. But I'll wait till we get to some other parts with that. Yeah.
All the white people in Compton here were setting this up as it was a issue to be dealt with, and they were all complicit in many different ways, whether they were active or inactive. But I think even just the who is it, Midge, I think, like the one who's going to be moving out anyway, that was I'm getting out, so it's not my problem anymore, right? That's what I got from it. So
that was there, and then someone pushed the issue to an extreme and pulled them along, as if some phrase we've heard a lot in the past 4 years, someone of power, someone of authority provides them permission for their weakest parts to come to the fore. That's why I asked if maybe it was a commentary more on the last 4 or 5 years, or if it was No, we're going to show you the human condition and how these things actually happen, or maybe it's both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love all the comments you're all making, and I'll just add this, and tempted to pose a question, but just to maybe kind of keep this going, and that's this, and I think Scott, you kind of gestured in this direction, and I think the question here is, to what extent in this show are we seeing a kind of new way of representing whiteness in popular culture? And I ask that because one of the things that struck me about this show was that you don't really see any redeemable characters that are white, right? I think another way that a word that I would use to describe these other characters is there are some like Betty that are kind of like influencers, right? I mean, and I'm using influencer in a kind of a broad sense, like social media influencer, or influencers in popular culture. I mean, the term influencer, when you look at like the history of this term in like social theory, I mean, you can go back to like literature in the 1940s, 1950s, like really actually even going back to like Adorno and Horkheim or others. I don't know if they really use this term, but the notion of an influencer, right, is clearly there when you see the rise of mass society and all the kind of sociological literature that's showing up in the 20th century about this condition of mass society, and this new era of mass communications, and what kinds of opportunities and dangers that presents, right? And you're seeing this influencer in a kind of micro, kind of dramatic form,
Yep.
right, with a Betty, or also a character like Epsy, right, who we begin to see in episode 9, and some of these other figures that are kind of pushing Epsy in a certain direction, as well as kind of like this head of this Protestant settlement. But what I saw in this series were a number of very kind of hardcore racists, and then a number of other white characters that, right? They may have been uneasy about the direction they saw things going, but they never wanted to put themselves out in front of it and resist it. They didn't put up a fight.
Right.
And we see this in different instances throughout this series. And what I love about this series is that you see this in different layers of time. We see this in instances in episode 9. We certainly see it in instances throughout the kind of contemporary 1950s in which this is taking place, right? Even Betty's husband, who's a closeted homosexual, is reluctant, but yet he doesn't really do anything. And that's a novel representation of whiteness, I think, because what we generally see from Hollywood is when we're dealing with kind of a binary or a dichotomy within whiteness, Hollywood has historically been very, very keen to establish, here's the racist, here's the ugly whiteness, but then here's the anti-racist white hero.
Yep.
And the narrative is driven by the anti-racist white hero, right?
Yep.
Think about like, Matthew McConaughey in Time to Kill, right? Or think about all these other white characters that are driving the narrative because they're heroically standing in for a redemption of whiteness.
Yep.
We don't really see that in this series. And this is what I find really fascinating about this series as a text that dramatizes whiteness in a specific kind of representational mode that I don't know if we've really seen. I could be wrong, but I'm just kind of putting that out there.
I agree completely. If you look at, for example, Lovecraft Country, you saw the character, you saw the whiteness there expressed in a few characters. It was not as stark as this. I mean, for me, this representation was just stark, to the point where even most of the camera shots were stark flat light, which I thought was a very stunning way to do it.
Yeah, and to go along with the whiteness, I was also paying really close attention to all the white institutions, and each episode had a very close correlation with those institutions. And so, the obvious ones being, the banking, financial, the redlining that we see happening very obviously. But I think we've got hospitals, we've got military industrial complex, we've got, and religion was handled very, very interestingly. I think that was a very complex portrayal of white religion. And I'll go into that in a little bit here, but just again, looking at each of the institutions that the Emorys are passing through and through various levels of horror. I mean, you know,
Well
I mean,
said.
to descent into hell through these institutions that are very white, right?
Yeah, I think Nathan just dropped the mic on us, guys. I think that was very well said and to the point. Saying, being there at that point, Nathan, why don't you give us
Yeah.
one of your bits?
All right. I was taken up by, again, kind of the bookending going on with the two Covenant episodes, right? You've got Covenant 1, Covenant 2, and I guess where I want to start with, and maybe this is where we can go into genre, right, is that so much of horror is kind of based on this notion that there's some sort of original sin that created the horror, that has to be accounted for. And so I think to wit and to kind of argue against those that say this is a really flat, uninteresting series, the by the time you get to episode 9 and they start getting into, again, the religious group, who happen to be Dutch, by the way. I don't know if anybody caught on to that one. And the Dutch in California have a really interesting history. Apologies to any in-laws that I have that are Dutch reformers living in California. But anyway, but it was not flat. And going back to this idea of kind of that original sin of racism, you know, horror, you know, you've got a haunted house, right? What caused it? Somebody was murdered there, you know, whatever. And we learn that, you know, towards the end. And I think that's where the genre or the horror genre really comes into play, right? And kind of expresses itself. But the original sin that you then get even more deeply, you know, is again this setup that it is, you know, a religious sin too, right? Like you see the racism institutionalized in that community through scripture, and brought up and used. And I think that is also a novel portrayal in ways that we don't often get. We've heard those arguments, we see those arguments, they've come up, but they have not been dealt with very well in pop culture. And so again, having this group, again, the Dutch in America have a very interesting history. A lot of it is actually strongly wrapped up in slavery, and you know, whether it's commerce or if it's again what we just saw there with religion. But I'm losing my train of thought here. But I think again, the way that was handled was very interesting. And as an institution, they could have gone after the church or different elements of churches, but instead they chose to focus on a fairly you know, fascinating theological point, I guess, right? Of you know, how text and how scripture is used, right? And so you see was it Epsi kind of battling with himself over like, how is this supposed to be interpreted, and again kind of gets pushed along into, you know, this just horrific interpretation.
Yep. And what I really appreciated about how they depicted his transformation is there were no public counter forces. There was the one woman in the final bit who was really trying to stop the group or at least persuade them somewhere else. But the only forces that were public, you know, there was a lot of him talking to God, but the only voices that were public were racist. And so there was no balance. There was no public argument. The whole thing is almost his internal struggle. And it's interesting how there would have been no struggle if he had started off in their spot. And they even hint at a bit of mental illness. I kind of experienced them hinting at a bit of mental illness with him in terms of talking to himself and answering himself. I'm not trying to explain anything away. I just, of course, that episode was horrific. And at the same time, I want to use phrases like, I'm not going to say anything like that. There was no space in that episode. It was so thick. and yeah, unbearable.
Mhm.
Thought it was extremely well done.
I think, Scott, but it also comes down to this notion of, in religion, the struggle is to win souls, right? You have to be a soul winner if you're an evangelist of any sort, right? That's your calling.
Right.
I think it's that. I think what they're really playing around with here is this notion of, I mean, in our contemporary culture, right? We think about white evangelicalism as this kind of, not being called to not being called to politics, but being called to be a soul winner, right? And I think, and I'm just thinking about this, so somebody help me out here, but this notion of, I think that struggle that he's having is this whole notion of, I want to win these souls, but, and I think they play around with this, is there a soul to be won in the Black body? Because, do these who aren't human in our eyes even have souls to win? And I think that's part of what I like so much about that episode was throughout it, you see this, as soon as they come in, my first thought was, uh-oh, this is going to be interesting, because these people are not going to see them as having souls here, right? And Nathan, you were talking about the Dutch. I believe it wasn't just California, but wasn't there something that happened with the Dutch in New York also?
Oh yeah, I mean they founded New Amsterdam. I mean,
And, yeah,
and just the theology though, I think is where it gets interesting, because I think what that group was kind of referring to was this Protestant Reformation group that came over in the mid 1800s, and they were huge proponents of again kind of exactly what you're talking about, right? Like who actually has a soul, and we are scripture alone, we're breaking off and leaving the old world to come over to the new world because it's been given to us, and so all we have to do is listen for the right things, and the racism inherent in the theology really is exactly that, like these people probably don't have souls, and so therefore it is our right to take their land, to take their bodies, to take their goods and services and labor and all of that. And that's not to single out the Dutch exclusively, but that, and that's not necessarily even just the evangelical experience. We're talking like the Protestant experience in the United States. Was very much built on that. But I think, again, looking at this kind of enclave, you see a lot of that come over and then translate into the 50s. Like here's the bookends for me gets so interesting here. I think of again, I have ancestors that were kind of part of that Dutch wave coming over the United States. But then I also have, more immediately, grandparents living in Chicago, living in houses that looked exactly like, what Betty is living in, living exactly that dream, behaving the exact same ways, and fleeing, like leaving sections of Chicago, because it's starting to look like Compton, so that kind of white flight happening, as a result as well. And you see, again, from that one religious community into the next generation, that notion of that sin kind of getting carried through.
So you talk about, Hiram, right, in episode 9, the transition that happens. So that episode was shot in black and white is absolute genius. The music, I mean, y'all know more about that than I do, but the choices that were made there were absolute genius. But the transition of Hiram, this guy who, out in the desert, whatever, trying to make their way and all of that, goes through a brutal winter, loses family, loses his faith, and is out like, what do I do, God? Show me the way. And all of a sudden, poof, here's the sun for you, right? And then they meet these strangers, they take them in. There is this driving force about racism, and it looks like the community has lost faith in Hiram, right? There's an argument like, what are you doing, dude? And with them trying to press like, these Africans don't have souls or aren't people or whatever. And poof, the little devil kid says, hey, here's a passage from Leviticus that says we can treat them as property. And that you're righteous to do that. And this is also, Hiram, I think one of the things that's fascinating, you mentioned mental health, that he's really a punk, right? I mean, he says he's all in this to serve God, right? And to serve his people and all of that. But really, he's a little tiny human that has lost efficacy and lost his way. And now he's grappling for, well, look, here's a little inroad with racism. I can get to power. And then ultimately live forever, right? So I think there's so much that's fascinating about that episode and that transition and what it says about people like that. We have so many people like that do anything to justify the most terrible behaviors. The other thing, and Byron, did we talk about Heather McGhee and the Sum of Us? Well, I think one of the really interesting arguments that she makes in that book is that white people need to understand that racism is bad for you too. So she talks about she talks about how we used to have really awesome swimming pools in this country, and every town had really awesome swimming pools. And then they got integrated. And what did white people do? Fill them up, close them down, right? That's not good for white people. It's bad for everybody. So they have this kind of zero-sum mentality. And you see at the conclusion of episode 9, what happens? The whole village, the whole community dies. Racism kills it all.
I want to say some things that I hope aren't too abstract. As a psychologist, I try to take a psychological approach to language and what people are doing and accomplishing with words. And it's interesting how the issue is we often act as if the words are what we mean versus are the words the sort of boundaries of the way we think. In other words, you create the rhetorical boundary you need to be the kind of person you want to be in a world of other rhetorical beings. So in other words, it looks like he's thinking really hard, trying to do the right thing. But in actuality, what he's doing is slowly but surely accepting a language system that allows him to feel better and complete about the situation, which of course leaves him the leader, leaves him on top. And so for me, so much of language is, what do you want? And the words are revealing what you want, what you're trying to keep the same, even though you're acting as if they point to the reality the way it is. And the words you're using aren't about you, they're about the world. The brain is extremely inefficient at making us feel as though the things we're doing aren't things we want, but things that should happen or things along those lines. So I thought that character was handled extremely well. And I agree with everything you say there.
Absolutely. No, I think Hiram was honestly one of the most fascinating characters for me of this series. Not only because we see him kind of in the flesh, but then we see him as a haunting figure, a kind of devilish figure that haunts the Emorys and all of these Black families in Compton throughout the series. And he's sort of like this kind of ghoulish figure that it takes the entire series until the end to really discover, okay, here's this origin story of Compton, here's this prehistory, here's this original sin. And I think one of the things that I liked so much about him as a character was that, again, you see that struggle, but at the same time though, and I'm curious what you all thought about this, because I watched episode 9 a few times, and to me, what's really well written about it is that it's ambiguous. I think that there's a number of potential competing motivations for this character, and they all kind of they're all kind of very complexly colliding with each other. And for me, it wasn't very clear exactly what's driving him. And I'm curious what you all think. So for me, a couple of things that I saw. The episode 9 begins with him at the tombstone of his wife and his son who have perished. We get the sense that they didn't survive a rough winter, right? This is an itinerant kind of, Protestant community, kind of in the same vein as the Protestant communities that are fleeing, these other areas. In their case, they're coming from Oregon, right? But of course, that's part of that same kind of, white immigrant narrative of fleeing either religious persecution or other kinds of forms of persecution, and using that persecution, that trauma, as an excuse to then project their own kind of, fantasies onto the other. Right.
Mhm.
And I think that if we take Dr. Craig's point about this being an interesting kind of representation of trauma, I think that this character and this white settlement, this Dutch settlement community, represents a really interesting complexity to how trauma works, right? We see trauma intergenerational, we see trauma interracial, we see trauma intraracial, right? If you think back to like these interesting scenes between the two Emerys, Lucky and then also what's the husband's name? I'm so sorry, I'm forgetting.
Henry.
Yeah, Henry, right? When we're seeing their past demons, right? Which is again another representation of trauma, right? They're demons that are kind of following them. But then the way they interact with each other, I think it was episode 2, right? Where we're seeing like this prehistory to Henry with the gas, with the world, these new weapons that are being used, right? In World War II, and then the horrors of that, right? And he loses a sense of smell, which again is pretty timely for COVID, right?
Right.
I wonder if they honestly wrote that in there for COVID. But you in him, right? And you see trauma driving him, right? He's got this loss, but then also what I loved about him, I think Steve, you brilliantly articulated this. He is clearly dealing with his own kind of legitimacy crisis within this Dutch settler community. And what I love so much about this character is that it becomes a very, I think, honest representation of whiteness, right? And specifically white leadership. When there's a political crisis within whiteness, white leaders play the race card. They go to the external other, whether it's the colonial other, right? Or within the history of the United States, we go to the immigrant other, or mostly to blackness, right? Blackness becomes this kind of scapegoat, this kind of symbolic receptacle upon which white politics is resolved, because we can all agree in that kind of classic, kind of, as Kenneth Burke said, right? We can't agree on Rome, but we can agree on who we hate, right? And that's what I see in him, right? He becomes this character that, you see him struggling, but yet he still says, like, I think one of the things that stood out to me when he first interacts with what are the name, Grafton, and what is the wife's name? The two traveling black characters, Grafton, and then the other is, I forget her name. But the first thing he says to them is, I'm in a state of confusion. I come back to my native tongue when I'm in a state of confusion, right? So he says he's confused, but then he also throughout the episode talks about his own prejudices, right? We see this clear prejudice, and we also see this trauma, and they're all kind of combining, and you don't really know which one is driving which, but we do know that throughout the episode, he sees a way out of his leadership crisis, his political legitimacy crisis, by basically selectively interpreting the Bible in a way that is going to unify his community's enmity, right? He adopts the racism of his own community to then save himself. And this is a narrative, this is a part of whiteness in the United States that I don't think that we have seen a lot of serious interrogations of in popular culture. That's what makes this show very unique in its representation of whiteness.
And to follow up on your analysis there, they almost show him arguing with himself over time to get to that point. There is no internet, there is no television, it's just there. And the sort of starkness of the space in that episode really kind of amplified what's he going to have to go through to get himself to that point where he does what he does. And he literally argues with himself and never experiences. I don't think he ever says, "Oh, this I need my power." Rather, he's just like he living as an organism trying to do a certain thing, and I just think they really rolled out his dialogue with himself really well in terms of how he'd ultimately persuade himself to for a particular course of action. It was stunning.
Hey, Scott, can I pick up on something?
Yeah, please do.
You as a psychologist, and something that Dr. Rocco brought up were these demons. But I was thinking too about the Emery family and their, I want to call them imaginary friends, but I guess they're not. They're not friends. But we've
Right.
got, Henry's got the tap dance man. Ruby has the white cheerleader
Right.
friend. Uh, Gracie has the teacher figure, right? And I was curious, what's your read on those imaginary beings? Are they hauntings? Are they inner voices? Are they how would you read that as a psychologist?
Well, that's one of the reasons I think this work is so good, and I'm going to say it that way, so good. And I'm going to use another word, poetic, and I hope no one misunderstands me, but it's written specifically to not tell you, right? It's up to you to tell yourself, are those inner voices? Is this a ghost story? And those are ghosts that are there? What's going on? And for me, good writing is such that there's a coherent narrative taking place, and then I am in it my way, and you're in it your way. And I have to admit, I go back and forth between experiencing it always to try to get a sense of what the writer was after. I have to admit anymore, that's just how I experience art, is what was the creator after. And so I go back and forth between these different ways of experiencing it. And so I think I don't think there's an answer in the sense of that's what they meant. I think what they meant was, we're going to give you something and you're all going to have your own reaction. And that's how I took it.
And I think, I like that, Scott, also because as you were saying that, it reminded me of Toni Morrison, actually, right? And that, I think that's one of the reasons why I like this show, is because we get these fragmented stories, right? And when you get fragmented stories that have to do with race and racism in America, I think it's totally left up to you to fill in. And Morrison always wanted us to be able to fill in the story for ourselves, right? To kind of get those interpretations. I shouldn't call them interpretations, but to gain an understanding of how racism and race work in America, right? And so like, for instance, when we meet, when we see, hold on one second, Grafton and Martha is her name, right? When we see them, again, it's a fragment of this larger story, right? This larger story of of anti-Black racism and trauma in the United States. And all these things are fragments, right? I think also the ghost are fragments, right? Are meant to serve as this part of that fragmented storyline for us to kind of think about, because these ghosts represent more than just a haunting, right?
Right.
They're very much about they represent the racism of America, right? And so, when we piece these fragmented things together, I think we're able to, go back to your point, Nathan, to, see these in different ways, right? So both as their ghost, but also as their trauma, but also as our ghost and our trauma as well. And that, for me, I mean, that's kind of why I kind of push back against the trauma porn thing. Because I'm like, no, I don't think it's trauma porn. I think it's fragments of trauma coming to life for us to see on the screen, right? If you read The Bluest Eye by Morrison, there's a traumatic scene that happens in that story, where two young Black folk are forced into carrying on their heavy petting by a white person with a flashlight, right? Keep doing this, and they're threatened. And I was talking to someone who said, I didn't realize these types of things. I said, well, again, it's a fiction story, but Morrison's whole point was, and I think it's the point of this also, to show these things that happen to Black folk that we wouldn't necessarily think happen, right? We think of, when we're taught about racism, we're taught about slavery, right? And so it's much more than just slavery. It's all these little acts that are fragments of Black life, right? That are the fragments of the things that we constantly have to endure even to this day. And those things add up and create our ghost, right? So,
Yeah.
I think that's a really great observation to think about, as in a way to kind of get around that notion of this being trauma porn. That's kept people from watching it, which I just still like it, but whatever.
I do want to follow up quickly on this idea of seeing the images on the screen in different ways, and that possibility. And what I love about this type of writing is that, on the one hand, are they demons? It's a horror story and they're quote unquote really there. Anytime a piece of work can actually put someone through those different perspectives for the same stimulus, what they're simultaneously teaching that observer is there are different ways to see things. And the more that we get used to looking at things in different ways instead of staying in a fixed view of the world, the more possibility we have of working and creating change. So even though I just say that it was a horror story and there was these different ways of seeing these characters and what they meant. It's also, I would just call it attitudinal mental exercise for the viewer to go through those different spaces. And my experience is that in the United States, what we tend to do is glorify the final decision. Okay, that's what it was. Even if you say that's what it was for me. And as a writer, I think the issue is it's not anything for real. It's for you to go back and forth with. It's for this culture to go back and forth with and use as a tool to talk about difference instead of saying that's it. And I'm not going to say I ever lived in a golden age of openness and open discussion, but I do sense a sort of glorification of final judgment in life in general, in the culture during my time on this planet. And I crave the openness, and I just love work that creates a space that provides these continuously challenging perspectives that say more about what the observer believes than what the art does.